So you've chosen to invest in dividend stocks and you want to know what are the best Australian dividend stocks there are. Well, you've come to the right place because today we're going to be going over 21 of Australia's best on offer stocks available. You heard me right, 21. But what makes an Australian dividend stock the best for the everyday Australian? You could just at a glance choose the one with the highest distribution paying out and then bam, in the next 7 years you're the new Warren Buffett. It's not the companies paying the highest dividends that make the best dividend stocks. No. I think it's much more important that you can reliably sit there knowing that your stock is actually going to pay a dividend. That's right, because just because a company has paid a dividend in the past does not mean it's going to pay a dividend in the future. So how do we solve this problem? It's quite simple. We pull out the history books and we go over the history of companies and their distributions over the past 20 years. And we're going to go over this in 4 segments, ending on some unusual companies that you might not have even thought of. So let's crack into it. And Australia, the land of the plenty. Of course, we're going to start in the mining sector. In front of you are 6 of the best paying and most consistent companies from the past 20 years in paying distribution to its shareholders. At a glance, you can see FMG is leading the pack with a crazy 11% return. But if you were to look a little bit more closely, they only paid distributions to their shareholders 13 out of the past 20 years. Now, that's still pretty good because that's more likely to pay distribution than not. For a slightly lower payout, you could choose one of these other companies that nearly all paid 20 out of the past 20 years. And you're probably still thinking, 13 years is still a lot of years, Thomas. And you're right. So let me frame this in another way for you. We're going to put FMG up against BHP for the last 20 years. Say you've invested $1,000 20 years ago and we're only going to count for market returns on your dividends. So dividend return compounding 13 years consecutively for FMG and 20 out of 20 years for BHP. In 20 years with FMG, you're 4 times your money with $4,151 return. That's pretty good. For 13 years out of 20 years, you can't complain with a 4x on your money. But what does BHP have in store for us? With that same $1,000, BHP has returned $4,202. This should help provide the perspective that consistency of distributions can be the key between you getting a good dividend stock and just a flashy dividend stock with a high yield return. And the mining sector having some of the best dividend companies on offer should come as no surprise to every Australian, as Australia comes 4th in the world for mineral exports, only leading behind USA, China and Russia. To further drive this home, Shanghai alone has a population higher than the entirety of Australia, and yet we're still punching well above our weight. Now, all this money has to move through something, so that brings us to our next sector, banking. Now, we wouldn't be able to talk about the banking sector in Australia if we weren't going to mention the Big Four, and respectfully so, as they are some of the best and most consistent companies paying distributions to their shareholders. And if you're willing to trust the bank with your life savings, why not put some of that money into owning said bank? Now, all these banks have shown a 20 on 20 year return paying distributions to their shareholders. But slightly out of the sphere of the Big Four is Suncorp, showing you that if you're not comfortable with putting your money in the Big Four, you can put it elsewhere. So you've probably seen a lot of very common names paying very good distributions and probably think, all I need to do is choose a blue chip stock in Australia for a company and it's going to pay me a good dividend and I can go to sleep behind the wheel. So let me put this to you. In front of you, you've got 2 iconic Australian companies, Coles versus Woolworths. And before you go any further in this video, let's be honest, comment down below which one of these you would have invested in before we go on with showing what you would have got in return. At a glance, the distributions are only 0.2% of a difference. So you're probably thinking, see, again, I could have picked either one and I would have been fine. But you would have eventually found out that in the past 20 years alone, Coles has only paid out distributions to its shareholders 5 out of the past 20 years. Meanwhile, Woolworths has paid 20 out of the past 20 years to its shareholders, finally proving that once and for all, Woolies is better than Coles. Now, let's move on to our third sector, the Australian dream, property. So it should come as no surprise that these property developers making the list for best dividend companies was inevitable. You have GPT, a real estate investment trust. A REIT is a fancy acronym just for a company that owns a lot of properties and manages all the finances for said properties. MGR, a property manager, and the well-known Stockland property developer. Now, all these companies have been pretty plain and boring, nothing really unusual or special about them. So if mining, banking, and property isn't something that you're interested in, let's go on for some more unusual suspects for this list. You have SHL, a laboratory health services. Though only coming in with a 3.7 yield return, it's still consistently paid dividends to its shareholders for the last 20 years. You have AMC, which is a packaging company, coming in with a pretty decent 5% return and 20 out of the past 20 years paid out. You got QBE, an insurance firm, paying out for the last 20 out of the 20 years with a notable 4.7% return. Now, what do these three companies have in common? Nothing. That's the beauty of this. You could have invested in each of these companies and say the insurance sector is getting a hit, doesn't really matter because your two other companies are invested in sectors that are completely irrelevant. That's the power of diversity and dividend stocks. A good 2-for-1 special. You also got CPU, an Australian stock transfer company, WES, Wesfarmers, a very well-known conglomerate, and TLS, Telstra. Obviously gonna make this list as it is one of the biggest companies in Australia. And though having a pretty rough history in the media, it's still paying a very, very decent 9.2% return over the last 20 years on average. And if with all this information today, you're still sitting there undecided, you can always invest in the good old ASX, averaging out with a 6.3% return, and obviously it paid dividends the last 20 out of 20 years. Now, before you come at me, these dividend yields are on average over the past 20 years. So you're gonna see that some, like FMG, paid out 25% one year, but then paid out 1.8% yield the next year.